Oh, Agnes,
Robin.
I thought we might talk about activism and activists.
Okay, great.
And the reasons I'm interested in that are that it looks like they are very influential for culture in the modern era, and they are a major cause of rapid cultural change, which is distinctive of the modern era. So I was wondering how distinctive activists were in the modern era. And um, I did a poll about sort of what's the essence of activism. And a simple model would be activists are just the ones who put more energy and specialize more, say, in trying to influence culture or politics. But it seems like there are other correlates. And one of them is a theme that I've heard you mention before is this idea that activists are more like warriors or fighters than scholars or persuaders or discussants. And that's an interesting observation. You'd wonder why. And for analogy, I guess, in history, things that were like activists were monks or warriors, um, or or maybe inspirational leaders of sort. I mean, there's a space of related things there. And so today, I mean, we have biopics that really celebrate activists. Martin Luther King say, there's almost nobody who's rated higher. And they are distinguished from politicians, although we often want to present politicians as influenced by activists and maybe in partnership with activists. But we want to make this distinction. The pure monk-like activist, which is sort of be different from the priest or the leader of a religion, like the monk or the saint is only, gets a leadership role if they're forced into it and they're kind of reluctant. As their priority is the pure religion. And then for the activists, I guess they don't want to compromise so much. Um, and I just was interested in culture 2 days ago, and so my university has a department of cultural studies. So I sat down to listen to an event of theirs, and it turned out to be an event where they had alumni trying to recruit new students. And it turned out basically all of these alumni were in activism jobs, by which I might think they were, part of foundations or they were part of groups that were funded to write things and push various points of view. And I was surprised that we basically have a department of activism. Maybe we have several, I don't know. But it shows how big activism is, that not only do we have a high cultural celebration of it, but there are chunks of academia where they see that as their major thing, to produce activists, to be activists themselves. Many people have accused academics maybe of being activists more than scholars, and the the shine and the glory of activism often seems to be more attractive to many academics compared to the shine of insight and scholarship. Anyway, so these are reasons why I thought it would be interesting to talk about activism.
Wait. So here's a small piece of the puzzle that just was striking to me. I would describe activists as altruists. That is, they present as altruists and they typically present as, I'm interested in a group of people who maybe don't have the advantages I have or who are being unfairly treated, and I'm going to use my privilege to try to benefit those people, or I want to get a group of people together to try to benefit those people. That's a common
Right.
scenario. But here's another common scenario, and it's often the same people. Um, some bad thing happened to me or to someone I love, and I want to make sure that doesn't happen to anyone else. So often, I might become an activist in relation to some disease that a family member of mine got, or I was treated in some unjust way. And now I want to make sure other people aren't, and I've recovered, or I'm okay, or whatever. But
Right.
um, and that always puzzles me because I'm like, but what about all the other diseases that you didn't get? Like, why do you care so much about the disease you did get? Especially if it's their child died from that disease, let's say, right?
Right.
Somebody's child died from that disease, then it seems like, oh, they're pretty likely they're going to become a crusader. They don't want any other children to die from that disease, but only that disease, not the other ones.
Right.
So that to me that well, hold on. To me, that illustrates that there's something interesting about the personal and the impersonal that goes with activism. That is, there is this personal tie, I experience something, and that's why I become passionately invested against it. But then also what I then turn into is somebody who is quite altruistic in some way, disconnected from my own interests.
Right. So many people are identified as being especially altruistic, kind on old Aunt Martha who always is welcoming of everybody and helps everybody on Thanksgiving, but she's not an activist. So clearly there's something more to being an activist than merely being altruistic because we have many. And your story about the origin story reminds me of, say, many preachers who want to tell their personal origin story, how they were once a sinner and fell to the bottom and then finally they found God and now that's why they're preaching. You might wonder, well, you know, if somebody else had fallen to the bottom, couldn't you have decided to preach on the basis of that? Why did it have to be you?
Well, I think that's quite different because I think that they are representing falling to the bottom as the worst possible thing that could happen to a person. Um, and so what they're saying is like, I saw the light, namely, I came to like the ultimate truth, and now I want to preach that truth. And that makes sense to me, actually. That doesn't seem super contingent. But if they're just like, well, I got leg cancer or something, and I'm really care now, but like, what if you'd gotten arm cancer? You're not saying leg cancer is the worst thing that there is. You're just saying it's a bad thing. Um, and, so I think it's not right, it's not just being inspirational. As it's of course not true that all activists have this kind of origin story. It's just that I think the origin story illustrates something about activism, which is that there's a moment of contingent choice. There's a lot of bad things in the world, and you have to pick, right? And it's not just that you have to pick, you have to get passionately invested. You have to care a lot about a particular bad thing, and so you're not in a way, you're not caring about, like, a certain group of people, you're picking out the thing you care about by way of some kind of affliction or some kind of injustice, not like any you're not, like, just benefiting anyone who's your neighbor or something. You're benefiting anyone who suffers from a certain affliction. There's something
So
univer
it occurs to me that superheroes are somewhat close to activists. So the superhero genre is a modern genre of the last century or so.
Yeah.
And superheroes don't so much have a cause, but they have an origin story and then an unusual urge to help, which goes along with some unusual superpower. But for that superhero, the unusual thing is their power, and then they tend to use it relatively generically, however they could to help people. And then the distinctive thing maybe about the activist is that they are really motivated by a very particular issue.
Right, but there's a sort of conceit in the superhero story that the kind of problem that the superhero can use their power to solve is the only kind of problem that exists in that world. So, like, in the world of Batman, there's just criminals who, like, mistreat people, but there's no, like, I don't know, people in loveless marriages or mental health issues or just people who are very confused about the way the world works.
Well, medical problems.
Medical problems, right, where, like, Batman can't help you with those things.
Right.
Mm, and, like, at least those things are not made salient, because if they were, then it's like Batman would have to make a choice, like, "Which of these problems do I solve?" And, you know, I mean, maybe in the case of Batman, that question would be answered by the fact, like, "Well, I have the power to solve this one." But in the case of the activist, it's not obvious that anything parallel obtains, like, why do you have the power to fight for the, awareness of this kind of cancer, not other kind of cancer?
So, certainly another distinctive feature of activism in the last century is it isn't typically just so much an individual person who had an individual experience and then becomes a certain type. And that's more the saint story in history. Saints have some particular history and then they become a certain kind of saint. But activists tend to be part of movements.
Right. So there's still the origin story, and then there's still this individual. Each person will have their own story of sort of what drives them to the movement. But you're right that then the power comes from the kind of collective. But I wanted to go back to the super. Maybe the Batman thing isn't such a bad analogy because maybe the point is that um there's something we like the thought of turning our misfortunes into superpower or something. And so maybe the thought is, well, I suffered this thing, but now I'm going to do something good with that. And that's my superpower. And my superpower, I got this kind of cancer, or my child got this kind of cancer. And so that's my superpower is caring about this kind of thing, the kind of bad
Right.
thing that happened to me, um, then we still need to add your component of I need to organize into a group to do that.
Right. So if I was trying to look at like when did activism arise in history exactly, and what can I see? And if I look farther back, say, 500 or 700 years ago, what I see are religious movements. And so that you have activists who are pushing a religious movement. So that's fully within the religious sphere. And then in the last century or two, you mostly have relatively secular movements. They tend to have religious support and religious allies, but like say abolition, it's not directly a religious thing. It's supported. I mean, many people were religious and that was their motivation, but the idea was that the cause that you invited people to join was abolition. You didn't have to join the religion to join that. And so there was this somewhat of a switch over time from religiously dominated movements with very passionate people and saints and uh, warriors even, um, and then to activism. And I guess I don't know enough history to know what before abolition was a good example of a secular social movement. Maybe I guess the French Revolution as a
About, like, banning alcohol, what's that called?
right. I think that was well, yeah, right. I think it was about the same time though as abolition, maybe,
Okay. That would
but
be
still, yeah, right.
um,
And so you're a classicist. Is there much in the ancient world of social movements, i.e., not a religious or a military or political group, but just someone with a social cause?
I don't know, I find it hard to answer, like, there were for instance, there were something gets discussed in a lot of the texts I read is that there were these itinerant intellectuals, sophists, who went around sort of selling their intellectual wares, which were teaching young men how to, like, speak well, how to win friends and influence people, basically.
Right.
And then there were people who were very angry about this, and basically the aristocracy did not like this because it was a kind of form of upward mobility. Um, and, um, it and so there was a bit of a crusade against these people. So
Right.
you wanna but I don't know, I mean, and some of them were put on trial for their lives, and in fact, Socrates' trial is plausibly understood, as part of that general, movement or something. So maybe that counts, but, it's hard for me to answer the question how exactly the organizing happened or even whether it happened.
So it seems an example of maybe a more conservative or reactionary movement, which sounds more plausible through history. That is, you had a stable culture and people like the way things were, and then something comes in and changes things, and then maybe you'd have a social movement to react to try to overcome that. It could even be, say, foreigners, populated our town, and we're upset about that. Say Jews at some place, more Jews in medieval history. There could be movements
Right.
set about the Jews coming
And
in.
against novels, like, people thought novels can't corrupt people, and so you might, like, have a movement against not allowing the reading.
But in the last century, we overwhelmingly celebrate social movements that are trying to initiate more of a change rather than return to a previous condition. And that's a distinctive modern phenomena.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of movements, like, sometimes it's hard to tell which of those we're doing, like, take environmentalism. Is
Right.
it trying to initiate a change or a return? Take, like, a lot of, like, just anti-capitalism, degrowth stuff.
Right.
Is it initiating or is it going backwards? Take stuff about, like, social justice, right? Um, I'm actually not sure how to.
Well, say, right. But say gender equality or trans rights or, homosexuality or abolition, those are more changes, clearly.
Right, right, right. That's right. So some of them are, but I don't feel like there's this big divide. There's this big rhetorical divide where somehow the, gender equality is like perceived as being really, really different from, say, environmentalism or something because the one is going backwards and the one's going forwards. But they
So, but a distinctive part is that we tell our history often in terms of these activist movements and the heroes of them.
Yeah.
So like Martin Luther King. And when the ancients told their histories, I read Herodotus, at least a lot of it, and I don't remember much examples of social activists being the heroes of history.
'Cause it would be people who started wars. Those would be the heroes.
Right.
So, you might just think, well, there were more wars, and people were really proud of their success in wars, and those are the stories that they would tell. And that nowadays, maybe there are fewer wars. I'm not I feel like that's a contested claim, but even if we have, in some sense, just as many wars, people are less proud about fighting wars and even winning wars than they used to be, so we gotta be proud of something else.
And there does seem to have been this trend toward more ideological slash religious wars over time. So that can be sort of a gradual switching. So certainly in the Protestant Revolution and for a few centuries afterwards, we have a lot of wars, but we have wars framed as holy causes, more so than most ancient wars, I think. And then we're celebrating the heroes of those wars who might be warriors or other things. And then religion declines and war declines, but we've replaced that with social activism. And in some sense, I mean, we're part of it is, puzzling over what exactly is an activist, because we see obviously they are more directly just someone who spends more time and energy and specializes more in trying to cause social change. But there seem to be other correlates. And one way to describe the other correlates, I think, is maybe to think of the warrior monk
Mm.
as the activist sort of combining those roles there. They are they are both seen as warriors. You can call them culture warriors today. And they are also seen as monks or especially altruistic saint-like people.
So, there's a phenomenon that I see a lot of, let's say, on Twitter, maybe it's even more prevalent on Instagram, which I'm on more rarely, which I think of as micro activism. It's like, um, somebody has some way of living their life. Maybe it's that they don't live in a city or something, or maybe it's that they run sourdough bread or whatever. And they're kind of like, "Look how great it is," and encouraging other people to do it their way, and, like, fertility is a big one where people are like, wanna nudge people and that are like, "Look, I had a little kid, you should have a lot of kids too." It feels like microactivism, like, it's slightly different to me, that is, they're maybe they wanna be maybe I'm not sure how to characterize the difference, like, maybe it's that they wanna be one of the first people to join the cause rather than a later joiner and
Right.
that big yet, um or maybe they feel like it's just a very gentle nudge rather than the more violent activist push. I don't know what the difference is, but it almost makes me think, well, maybe activism is everywhere, and it's just a question of these other differences in terms of the how we pick it out.
So I might suggest that it didn't used to be everywhere, but
Mm.
that as we've come to celebrate activists more, then more people have tried to make activism part of their role in the world. And
Right.
so academics, for example, are now much more trying to be activists. I don't think 1910 academics were trying especially to be activists, but today a lot of academics are wanting to be activists as part of their role. They want somehow that to be research. And many, say, musicians and artists of many sorts often aspire to include activism within their art. And so then you might think we just generally approve of people trying to include some degree of activism in everything they do.
And maybe it's like generally approve of is too weak. Like it might just be almost just the language that we speak to such an extent that we can't even understand people unless they're doing that. So, like, I was thinking about a piece I wrote over the summer, and the editor really trying to nudge me to a moral of the story where it's like, um, this shows the wisdom of the teenage girl or something like that. Like, where it was like she's like, "What are you saying?" i.e., what cause are you pushing in this piece? And it wasn't her personally, what she was doing was channeling my reader, right? And she's presumably good at that. So she's channeling the reader's expectation, and so clearly, she's probably right that what the reader is expecting is that at the end of this piece, they're going to learn what I'm fighting for, what I'm crusading for. And if I don't give them that, then they don't even know why they read this essay.
Right. So one way to think about culture and morals is that our stories give us prototypes of lives to live and characters to be, and that they have heroes and villains. And so we are trying to live our lives in such a way as to be somewhat like the heroes of the stories we like and, you know, feel strongly. And that most of our heroes these days are in some way an activist. I mean, even like a crime drama or even a doctor drama, often we're going to present our hero crime and investigator or doctor as someone who's unusually motivated and trying especially hard to discover the criminal, willing to make personal sacrifices, even disobeying their boss, whatever it takes to achieve their, you know, crime finding goals. But we're almost trying to make them an activist hero.
I think that there's a little bit more that activism requires. That is, if you really cared about, crime fighting, you might not yet be an activist. I think if you, let's say you had a childhood history of sexual abuse, and therefore you wanted to make sure, you know, the kind of sexual abuse that you suffered is penalized and also deterred and prevented, right? That's more like activism. And so I think it's characteristic of activism that it directs our attention to some group of people, where the group of people is picked out by a form of misfortune or injustice. That is, that's the kind of person we're talking about, is the kind that suffered a certain kind of misfortune or injustice. Um, and we're then invited to attend to that group where there's not necessarily any claim being made that this is the worst misfortune or the worst injustice, right? Like the fact that teenage girls are have their wisdom underestimated would in no way be, it would not, if I wrote, this, if this essay came with that moral, it wouldn't imply that's the worst thing in the world. It would just be like, attend to this group of people and this injustice that they are experiencing. That seems crucial to me. Over, like, it's not just that there's a hero and that they care about other people, it's that form of caring.
So I think there's a complicated zoo here of different characters that have different relationships to each other. I certainly think that the person who has a personal origin story that drives them to this activism is seen as higher status and more legitimate. But if we think of all the academics who are trying to be activisms about, say, racism or sexism, most of them don't actually have a personal story about why that went so wrong for them in their past, but they're still eager to be activists about these things and they're counted.
I think that you'll see a strong correlation with the race and gender of the person and the issue. No, it's not gonna be 100%, it's not even gonna be 90%, but there will be a correlation.
No doubt the correlation, but there is this idea that if you work hard enough against racism, you're allowed to be seen as an activist for that, even if you don't have a personal origin
That's
story.
It's not a necessary condition. Um, that's true. But right, so I agree. I don't think the origin story is a necessary condition. I just think that it shows us something about activism. I think the necessary condition is just the thing that I just said, namely, there have to be some group of people to which our attention is being directed, where that group is picked out by the misfortune or injustice that they have suffered. I think that
Although that's a modern thing in the sense that you could have I mean, for example, environmental activists aren't trying to protect any particular people. Maybe it's the animals they're protecting or the plants. But there are kinds of activism in history where it wasn't oriented around a particular group of people you were protecting, but that is much more the modern model, I'll grant.
right, and it's going to be. I mean, I think it's relevant that it's typically not gonna be, like, there's some other characteristics of people where you might have thought that it matters that they, like, live near you or you know them or what, like, if the activism has to cut across all of those kind of, um, boundary lines. It's anyone with this sort of cancer. Um, but, sorry, wait, I wanna add another thing, which is that it isn't always necessarily that crucial to activism that you end up doing anything at all about the problem. That is that the
Right.
crucial bit is the thing I said, which is the attention. That is, There's some group of people, they have some form of misfortune or injustice. They're picked out in no other way but that, and you're supposed to attend to that. That seems to me to be now, presumably, there's some idea that if you do attend, that's gonna be in some way good for these people, but that part is often quite kind of wavy. Like, I wouldn't have had to specify any way in which my piece was gonna improve the situation for teenage girls. It would be suffice if I just, called attention. So calling attention is a very important moment in activism, I think.
So let's try to take an intermediate case. Say there's a town and there's a dump part of the town and there's lots of trash or litter there and maybe dangerous things. And a group of people gets together. Let's clean up the dump. Let's clean up this part of town. Now, that's the sort of thing that often happens in small town organizing.
Yeah.
And I think it's in sort of an intermediate case because even though they're passionate and they're doing something, we're not quite sure we want to call them activists
Right.
because there isn't enough of, I think, of a moral color.
It's not altruistic enough.
Well, it might be they're not next to that part of town. Maybe it's somewhere else. Maybe poor people are next to this dump they're cleaning up, so they're trying to
I
help
think it
them. But
sounds more like activism if the dump is far away and it's near the poor people, and it's the rich
okay,
people. Now it starts to sound
okay, right. So now we're getting some altruism. But I also think that merely being altruism isn't quite enough to get the highest tier of activism. I think you need some sort of moral indignation, a sort of like there are enemies that you're fighting against, people who have the wrong opposite view, and it's part of the warrior part of activism that you are fighting those other people. Maybe, maybe there's a factory next to the dump and they're resisting the cleanup and now you've got an enemy and now it looks more like an activism because you're fighting someone.
yeah, and maybe that's part of why the attention, um, is such a common framing for act to pay attention because there's a natural zero-sum battle aspect built into attention. That is, there are a lot of different demands on your attention. And
Right.
so if I say pay attention to the way in which teenage girls are underestimated, I'm implicitly saying don't like take your attention away from all the other things that you were thinking about that are, maybe not as important as this thing. Um,
But we don't usually want to highlight the conflict between different activists pushing you in different directions. We usually want to highlight the activist versus the villain opponent of the activist.
but it might be enough to highlight the activist versus non-activist mentality. That is, you were just going through your day, doing your regular stuff, being selfish, not thinking about the plight of the less fortunate and those treated unjustly. And what I'm going to do is pull you out of that. I'm fighting your egoism and saying, look, pay attention to this. And so I think that there's a kind of minimal warrior thing built into that moment.
I agree. Uh, so I definitely think there's both the fight against indifference and the fight against the villains, and both of them energize the activism and the movement, and they make them more of a saint. A saint is not just someone who opposes the devil; they also someone who rose above indifference and neglect and laziness to do something.
I think it's very, very different from saints because I think part of the idea of a saint is someone who's above us in a way where our appreciation of them isn't much going to matter to them. That may not be true, but that's the conceit of calling them to be a saint. Like people tend to be nominated as saints like after they die. I think with the activist, and it may be that someone like Martin Luther King is like moving over into saint territory, but a standard issue activist is not Martin Luther King. And the standard issue activist, I think it's a pretty important part of activists that there's a lot of mutual reinforcement and appreciation and approval. That is, although activism involves a fight at one end against the evil or the indifference, there's like a party at the other end, which is like all the activists patting each other on the back and saying, you're a really good person. Or that's not like saying you're a saint. It's like saying you're one of us and we're the good people.
Well, I have at times looked at the list of saints that the Catholic Church issues. They issued another dozen in the last month or something.
Yeah.
And we will go through their names. They look like they're mostly activists. So today, saints are primarily activists.
Sure, but most activists aren't saints, and being a saint doesn't give you a good grip on the appeal of activism for most people. That is, we're saying we live in a world where lots and lots of people, maybe everyone is kind of an activist. Not everyone is a saint. Not everyone is even in the running for being anything like a saint. So I just think the appeal of activism isn't you're not gonna cash it out very well if you think about saints.
So the question I'd like to call attention to is, basically the question of why is our world so much more obsessed with activism and activists and giving it so much for prestige? What caused that? And then what are the causes of that? How is our world different because of such celebration and eagerness to be activists in most all roles in life? That is, almost everybody is trying to find themselves as some way to see themselves in part as an activist doing the other things they're doing.
Right. Well, maybe like one thing you could do is try to use this is your least favorite method, introspection. So like, you're a bit of an activist about fertility. Like I noticed you retweeted it. I know you said you make that face, but that's my point. That's what you're going to be able to introspect here. Um, that you retweeted a bunch of stuff like it's a really bad problem, or like you're a bit of an activist about cultural drift or something. Like you want people to get worried. You want to, and this is your like in terms of your bid to show other people how you matter. It's as an activist, you're in favor of trying to fight the decline in fertility, and you're in favor of taking cultural drift seriously, and you are going to retweet stuff and promote stuff that you know
Right.
part of your cause, and you'll maybe join together with some other people who have the same cause. So think about why you're doing that.
So we discussed modernism in a previous
Yeah.
podcast. And one of the distinctive features of modernism was this eagerness for and celebration of innovation in the arts, in
Mhm.
literature and painting, etc. And this idea that, nothing was really good unless it was causing something new. Merely being excellent in an old artistic style was just not worthy of the highest praise in modernism. And it seems like we've done that with culture to some extent as well. That is, it's not good enough just to be an exemplar of past culture achieving its highest ideals. In some sense, we reserve our highest status for the people who seem to be trying to and successfully changing culture.
Yeah, I was sitting in on a class. A colleague of mine is teaching on Foucault yesterday, and she was paraphrasing this woman, Nancy Fraser, talking about Foucault, and this is the sentence that I wrote down that she said. There's nothing more modern than finding the most fundamental principle of your age and then attacking that in the name of something new. That is, there's nothing more modern than rejecting the modern.
Or the past previous modern and making a
Right,
new
right.
one.
But the point is, it's now the modern. You always need to be moving on. Like Uh, and her Fraser's point in saying this, I mean, this is not a quote from Fraser. This is a quote by a Christian who's teaching the class, but she's paraphrasing Fraser. The point is that Foucault thinks of himself as opposing this modern order, but in opposing it, Fraser's saying, no, he's just perfectly instantiating it. This is what it is to be modern. He's perfectly conforming to the of modernity, which is self-undermining in this way.
And this use of the word modernity that you're favoring and I favor with you is basically saying we're still very modern and we haven't escaped modernism at all.
Right, it's saying postmodernism is just more modernism. That is basically this is a way of explaining that point, right? The reason why postmodernism is just modernism is that modernism was already from the beginning.
Right. Except since postmodernism is now 70 years old, surely you wouldn't be happy with the label postmodernism anyway by now, right?
You're gonna need postmodernism, but it'll just still be the same thing. That is, we're stuck in an interesting way because the thing we fastened onto was a thing where, it seems like um, uh, the formal principle is a kind of repetitive one.
So this is to me puzzling, and I'm just going to keep reflecting on it for the coming months, and you won't be able to solve it here. But to me, it's just intrinsically puzzling that you have people in a culture with some mix of cultural symbols and things like that, and they have, the way things are. That the puzzle is, how is it that, we have an energy to change something that we have, that we somehow want it to be different, but somehow the different thing has to meet some standards of the kind of change we want. So, what are these standards of changes that are good? How are we evaluating proposed? I mean, there's all these people pitching various changes. Most of them are going to fail. Only some, activists' bids are going to succeed. And we have to therefore have standards. Which ones energize us? Which ones do we want to get behind? Which ones do we are we going to push forward and then allow to succeed and then celebrate? How do we decide which changes we want or will embrace? Seems like it's like fundamentally like you have to be some standards, otherwise everything would be equally available to change. But then these standards must then have to be constant over time, and so we're not challenging those standards.
Well, I gave you one answer, namely, I got the leg cancer, I didn't get the arm cancer. And there's gonna be a bunch of other people to whom that also happened, and then we
Right.
like, so there's just contingent stuff that happens to you.
But the bid is for a larger world to agree and accept your new bid. That is, activists are often trying to get the larger world to see something different. It's
Right.
not just the people, basically, say breast cancer. Some people had breast cancer in the past, and now, and then breast cancer people saying, no, the rest of the world needs to appreciate the problem of breast cancer and they need to have pink ribbons, etc., in order to persuade everybody else to care more about it. That's the bid.
Right. And I guess I think, it kinda just works for most things that we haven't paid attention to before. It's almost like everything and it will get at you again too, like, it'll plan. Um, but it'll be a function of, again, a bunch of contingent stuff, like how charismatic or the like, what's her name? Greta Thunberg, right? She was kind of
Right.
charismatic and a bit unusual and a bit surprising, and that made a big difference. So there's just I think there's just gonna be, like, a lot of contingent or accidental stuff that factors into, like, who is successful in kind of galvanizing a group together and then also in, putting the right kind of making that group's message somewhat compelling to people outside the group.
So, but that the words you used to describe Greta suggest some more constant standards. That is, those same standards might have been applicable 50 years ago, 100 years ago, for who won their cultural bids for activism. So we might think more fundamentally someone who's young, articulate, energetic, has good connections, b- is interesting compared to boring. Like maybe those are pretty constant standards.
Some of them I think are. So, like, if we think about the ancient sophists, like, some of that's gonna be true of them. Certainly articulacy is an important one. Um, but, I think, like, the fact that Greta Thunberg is autistic was probably an advantage in the time when she was coming up, but would at most times probably not have been an advantage in terms of galvanizing a group of people. And so there are gonna be changes in her youth. Like, at sometimes that's gonna be an advantage, at other times it's gonna be a disadvantage. Um, so I still it still seems to me like there's a lot of contingency even in the question of which factors count as pros versus cons.
And there must also be some sort of parameter of just how eager for or reluctant are we from change. So my understanding is the ancient world until a few centuries ago, these sorts of bids would just typically fall flat no matter how charismatic or pretty or articulate were, because the world was just not very interested in making big changes. And now we are not only interested, we're expecting, like
Right.
with fashion, that if it's been a while, we haven't seen a big change, we're ready for a big one. And where is it? It's due.
Right, so maybe, like, there's a thing where maybe there's just it's an independent parameter, like, how much change do you want? And, um for any proposed change, you might be like, but how do we decide whether or not to accept it? And maybe the answer is like, our default now is accept it. Accept it unless you can come up with a really good reason why that change would be incredibly destructive.
Well, we must have a larger default. But so another thing to notice here is that businesses are all the time trying to frame their product or service in a more activist way so that you will jump on the bandwagon of their product or service.
Right.
And clearly, we can't accept all of those bids. So most of those bids are failing where somebody, tries to make a new kind of, I don't know, potato chips or whatever, and tries to make it seem like it's an activist potato chip
Right.
and connects it to a cause. And most of those are going to fail. So clearly, we can't just have a default for acceptance for that category of things.
Right. Right. So, but like, I think the issue is just that, um, like the activist potato chip, like, it's just probably not gonna sound that different from a bunch of other bids, so that it actually doesn't seem like, when they came out with the Dyson vacuum and stuff, and he was like, "I just want things to work properly," and, like, that was a kind of activism where this guy's like, "People are not vacuuming in the right way," and, like, I thought about the science of vacuuming, and I'm doing a whole new thing in vacuuming. And, like, this kind of, uh, aw shucks, anti-elite, like, there's a certain persona that was very compelling, where you really thought, this is a new kind of vacuuming that I'm gonna be doing if I buy this vacuum." And, like, so it's not so easy to do that, to sell it as something really new. I suspect that most of the ways in which you make the activist potato chip, we're just gonna be like, "Nah, I've seen that before. That's not really new."
Right. So then we have some standards of not just is it how long has it been since we've had a change, but maybe how big. Like we're looking for novelty in certain ways, not just change.
Yeah, it's like like most forms of activism are by now pretty passé, right? So you gotta impress us. We're a little hard to impress at this point. So if you're just like, my potato chip fights racism, it's like, well, how? Like what? I've seen a lot of claims of that kind. Like, do a little more um uh to make me think that there's something special going on here.
So when is there so in some kinds of fashion, say length of hemlines or hair, there's a cycle, long hair, short hair, etc. But for other kinds of more activism fashion, it looks like anything that's been around for 300 years that we can remember that doesn't count for new. We're reluctant to go back to things from 300 years ago in sort of moral social change fashion. It looks like we're sort of determined to make sure we go somewhere that hasn't been seen for a very long time, if ever.
No, no, no. There's this whole trad movement online of people who are like, we need to just, go back to making things inside your home and baking your own bread and like, um, no screens. And it's definitely a form of activism. And it's saying that we should go back like 100 years or so.
Well, I guess that maybe I just say that's a distinctive thing that we treat differently. Somebody whose bid is to have us go back is sort of a different kind of bid than a bid to go somewhere new. And maybe we're open to both kinds of bids, but we will definitely think about them differently.
Right, and I guess I think that, so just like I was saying that it's not actually so clear how to draw these lines, like the environmentalist, in a way, they're saying go back, but they don't feel retrograde. Um, I think that if like the trad person, it's easy depending on, they might emphasize, say, traditional gender roles or something, then that'll be like their thing, but they might just emphasize like making stuff with your hands or something. Lots of progressives can get on board with that. Um, and in that might get charged morally quite a lot of like, we live in this terrible world where we're enslaved to our phones and computers all the time, and like there's this better life that's possible for us, where it's not so much perceived as going back, but as superseding or overcoming a certain challenge in modern life, and therefore as moving forward.
Right. So I'm interested in that choice of framing because often people in the past have sort of made left versus right. Left wants to change things, right wants to return to the past. But say if you think about cell phones or social media, it's a pretty left position now at the moment to want to have less screen time, use phones less, maybe less social media time, and that's seen as a progressive sort of movement. But how does when does it seen as conservative and when is it seen as progressive if you're trying to go back to something previous?
I think there's just a question of, is it framed as back? And maybe progressives, just like progressives are not gonna they're probably not gonna frame environmentalism as let's go back to the past. Even though you could frame it that way, right?
Right.
But they're gonna frame it as like, let's overcome the horrors of late capitalism or something. Let's triumph over them. Um, and maybe there is some amount of let's romanticize peasant life or something. There probably is, like, I guess I feel like I'm not sure how to I'm not sure that the framing of backwards and forwards tracks that much.
Right, but it might still be a salient framing for people. Here's another meta question. In this world where we're so eager for change of these sorts, could we ever find a good cultural place and stay there? Or is this permanent wandering? Are we set to be wanderers? And, in a lot of literature and music, there's this distinction between a wanderer and a settled person. And we often celebrate the wanderer. But then part of many stories is you finally found someone who would make you settle down because they were so special, right? Will we ever find something so special? Could we ever find something so special to make us stop wandering?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and you might think, um, culture, um, cultures have always wandered. They've been somewhat tempered by selection pressures, but not, like, completely, and they've wandered way slower than we're on. They've always wandered, and the wandering has always been incompletely tempered by selection pressures, just in the sense of think about different languages or something, they haven't converged. Um,
Sure.
and
But they've been functional. You could say languages have been adaptive. And so they didn't move too far away from being adaptive languages, even if they weren't convergent to the same language.
well, I mean, the question of adaptive, like, I I I don't wanna grant that because 'cause I'm just not sure we know what adaptive means. That is, if what it means is everybody didn't die, yes, that but if what we mean by adaptive is, like, they led to genuine flourishing, then we need a sense of what flourishing is, and, um, the thing I wanted to say was that if we just think about they were wandering, um, and we're wandering, but they were wandering slow, we're wandering fast, um And it's the same question for the 2 groups. Um, it's just that
More urgent for the faster
well,
ones.
exactly, right? And I feel like that's the big thing we're gonna find out, right? So, like, if you imagine that, um, there maybe there really is some good cultural place, then we're gonna be the ones to know that we found it because it will be so remarkable that we stopped anywhere that must be the good thing. It's a little bit like talking to you versus talking to most other people. So when I talk to most people, they say to me, um, "Oh, that's a good point," or "Great thought, Agnes. You're so smart," or, you know, "You're a deep or interesting philosopher," whatever. Like, whereas you, like, dismiss or ignore most of the things I say. So it's like a lot of rejection, 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 but if I ever say something where you're like, "That seems like a good point," I'm like, "Wow, like, that must have been a really great point," right? And so we're at that stage of, the history of civilization where should we stop on anything, that must be a great point.
But do we know what we would be looking for to stop? I mean, that was part of, say, the modernist literature scenario. We had these characters who were eager to change things, but they didn't really have a way to evaluate changes for being good or bad. It seemed like they couldn't tell.
Right,
It
well,
all
I think
seemed
you
uniformly.
know what you're looking for. Like, I have some kind of theory of what you're gonna take to be a good point? No. Um, Still, there's such a thing as a stopping point, so we might just notice that we stop. You may not need a theory of what you're looking for in order to stop. Like, if you're tasting a bunch of flavors of ice cream, right? You're
Right.
like, "Nah, nah, nah," and then you get to one, you're like, "Wow, it's amazing." Do you have a theory of why you like that one? Maybe not. I I prefer a theory, but I'm
I
just
mean, part of the problem is that we often have this theory that there are these nefarious forces trying to prevent change. And if we don't suppress them, then they will stop change. And so we are, you know, opposing those forces in order to be in this, courageous activists looking for change. So we might slow down and then think, oh, it's those nefarious slow downers who are causing this.
right. Um, I mean, it's basically I feel like the deeper problem is that we're, um we're so used to a kind of adversarial position where if somebody else is pushing some change, you have to push back against it, that we might not, um, give it enough credit of, like, um, uh
I have an example here.
yeah.
So, um, I grew up in the 60s as young, a teenager in the 70s. And at that point, young people were very proud that their music was a rebellion against the previous generation's music. And that, in some sense, legitimized in their minds the fact that they were new and trying to do things new, is that they had a different music. And then I read something recently about how maybe the last generation kids don't mind listening to their parents' music from the 90s. Many of them are okay with 90s music, even though it's, 25 years later. And then I think, oh, well, have they lost the revolutionary impulse? These
Right.
young folk are, should they feel a little ashamed of themselves that they're not rebelling against their parents' music? I mean, that's, because of the standards I have from when I was young, that's a suspicion that rises in my mind.
Right. Exactly. As opposed to just like, you know,
Maybe they found better music. Maybe 90s music was better than 50s.
really good. We should all be listening to them. um uh right. So um I think that that's right, and like an even clearer to me example is just like we now like let's say movies. There are a lot of franchises and a lot of also reboots and whatever, and like
Around for decades now.
most people see that as a bad thing, as like decay or what's that word, stagnation, right? Right. Um uh and and there is a like I think there's a kind of confounder here, which is that um um if you have a longer time horizon, it makes more sense to explore rather than exploit, right? So, if you're at the if you're at the end of your culture in some sense, you should just be exploiting, you should just have your repeat series, whatever.
Yeah.
And so the repetition gives off the vibe of like end of history.
Yeah.
And so that's gonna be a huge confounder for no, maybe we found the good thing. Yeah, I think that's a really big problem.
We might reject a good thing because we think, no, we're explorers.
We're still it's a long journey ahead of us. We romanticize the journey to the point where we reject a perfectly good destination.
I feel like there must have been Western stories like that of the wanderer who should have stopped somewhere, but kept wandering and regrets it later. Many 5 towns later, he says, I should have stayed back there. What am I doing out here?
Right.
But now it's too late or something. And it's a sad tragedy story.
Right. 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 Um, it's like a it's like a really large scale version of like an optimal stopping problem. Like, the secretary
Right.
um where as an entire civilization we've got to decide when is something good enough? When have we tried enough things that were
Right.
like the best? And
I mean, there are some things in our society where we made a lot more changes early on and we haven't, like cars, for example, right?
yeah,
For the last decade or so, cars have been pretty much the same. And at the early days of cars, they had all this varieties of shapes and sizes and arrangements. And now we're all agreed on the right car. And then roads, even we've pretty much agreed on what roads should look like. And we have relatively limited numbers of road innovations. And you might think, well, is that us being less creative and innovative, or is that because we found a thing that works and we're going to stick with it?
right. Like it's hard. It's actually, I think one of the big problems is that it's really, really hard to tell those things apart. So, like with cars, I think it's plausible that the shape of the car is just sort of a pretty good shape for cars to have, in terms of the various trade-offs of being aerodynamic and fitting stuff inside of it and whatever. But is it plausible that like it's better for cars to be just like black, white, and gray as opposed to all the different colors? To me, that's less so. And so it seems like we've gravitated towards fewer colors of cars. And I'm just skeptical that that's because that's the better place for us to be. And so the shape of the car versus the color of the car, like one of them might be optimal, one of them is non-optimal, and then everything might be mixed up in that way.
So I think we're actually getting at a really key issue for society and that you and I have disagreed about because, I'm from STEM more, and in STEM we have these standard criteria for evaluation of a bridge or an engine or things like that, and we design and improve things to, improve on those metrics. And then in humanities or values, it can just be hard to know whether a new aesthetic, a new vibe, a new style a set of values or norms are actually better, because often it kind of evaluates itself, or somehow you use, nearby standards to evaluate something. And then how would you know if in fact the whole trajectory was getting better? I think that's kind of, in some sense, the cause of cultural drift, is that we don't actually have such standards much. And that's why we just keep wandering in the culture space, because we have this, the one thing we think we know from Musil is that things should change. That's the one confident thing we have, is that this can't be right. We should be looking for something new. And if that's the only one thing that you feel very confident that you can judge about new things, is that you want new things, well, you're just destined to keep changing forever.
Right. And like, I guess I think um it it seems to me that there's a difference between how you present the novelty. Like, suppose that um let's say you were looking for something very specific in a secretary, right? A very specific set of skills. Um and and so you keep trying out new secretaries, and you're like, this one's not good, and this one's not good, and this one's not good. Um, but you can, um, but you can say, okay, but this is what I want. Like, I want one who can type at this speed or whatever. Um, bit of an outdated.
Right.
um, um, and and so we're like that. That is culturally, we're like keeping on trying out new things, right? But except we don't have the sense of what is it that we want the culture. We can't articulate it. And so you might think, well, let's say you had the person, right, who kept trying out new secretaries, and he claims that he has a really specific sense of what he wants from the secretary, but like every time you ask him to say it, it's kind of gobbledygook.
Right.
And he just keeps trying out new ones. And you might think the one kind of change, I mean, one thing you might propose is, look, just find one and just be happy with it. But suppose he can't. I mean, he just keeps on like, then you might say, well, you should have a different attitude to this whole process. You should just kind of have more of a curious and inquisitive attitude, where you are sort of saying, look, I don't know what it is that I want, and I have to sort of live that way and be trying things out and be figuring them out. And I have to have just a very different ethos from the ethos of the boss who's like, I need 175 words an hour, a minute, or whatever. And maybe like the situation that we're in is we're like at this optimistically, we're at this transition point where we still have the face and the bearing of, I just need someone who can type this many words a minute, but we can't say anything to that effect, and we just keep firing secretaries. And that, like, one possible transition would be to become the kind of boss who starts to realize that they're gonna learn from the performance of each secretary what they might want, and they're not gonna know how to say that, and, like, they're just gonna have to, like, be a lot more humble about what it is that they're doing.
So, I mean, if you look at, say, the Amish or Haredim or something, we have these subgroups, and they think they found something, and they're going to stick with it. And they're not so much searching in a vast space of alternatives.
Hey, they're like, "I just want 170 words a minute, I found that, we're just gonna keep hiring people that can do that." Right, so that's one option, and so at a meta level, you like variety, right? And so it's good. We got people who are doing that thing, and then here we got us are doing a different thing, and, one of them will turn out to be the better way to do things, and the nice part is, the better one is guaranteed to win. Um, so, because 'cause it'll be, well, I mean, on your definition of adaptive, right? Um, and so maybe it will turn out that just deciding you're good with 170 words per minute and just sticking with that is the way to go. Or maybe, you know, having this other attitude where you don't actually know what you want from a secretary, and you're gonna kinda keep hiring them and firing them and hoping that somewhere along the way you figure it out. That's the other approach.
So, if I'm right in my guess that over the coming centuries, our civilization will have a decline, that's more analogous to these stories of the wanderers who, had a very exciting young life as a wanderer, and then they're older and more infirm and in less nice territory where they're wandering. And at some point, they should decide maybe it's time to stop wandering. And so maybe as our civilization declines, it'll be seem more salient, this idea that maybe we've been wandering too long, and maybe we should stop wandering so much and pick something and stick with it.
Maybe, but that rhetoric is gonna if you push it too early, it's just gonna be easily conflated with the anti-change people. Like, "Oh, you're one of those bad guys who one of those nefarious forces that are trying to prevent change," right?
Right. I mean, your larger framing is this idea that, your explore exploit is that, well, we should have a period of exploration and then we should pick stuff. But in some sense, we aren't really able to sort of organize a plan on that scale of civilization. At each time, we have sort of a set of norms and they just have the momentum of continuing. So, yeah, I don't know if we could switch it. Yeah. So, given that we've decided that we are definitely exploring people and we want to resist these stoppers, then we're just going to maybe have a momentum that just keeps taking us much longer. Just like, what I guess an analogous thing is like when people are trying to be an actor or musician or athlete early in life, and at some point, most of them have to quit. And it's kind of unpleasant to quit, right? You had these great aspirations and they aren't working out. Many academics are like this too, right? Or early wannabe academics. And there's a point at which you sort of need clear enough signals that people say, you're not, those people are successful, you're not, you need to like go do something else. And, I guess the question is, will humanity ever get those signals so clear? Because we don't have all these comparisons, right? So at least if you're a young dancer and you see this, people in your dancing cohort and a few of them have gone on to success and the rest of you are failing, and you can say, okay, I guess I'm one of the failures. But um, even that's a potential framing. You see, we think that we might well interpret stopping as admitting failure. We had these higher aspirations and we're not going to continue after them. We're going to accept this lower thing in our hand as our resting spot.
Right. Right, though it's just worth noting that, um, like, that's one kind of danger, and the other kind of danger is the opposition to innovation and giving up on it, right? So
Right. Yes, a standard story is that young people aren't very invested in the standard way of things, but old people are. So old people resist change because they'd, lose their investments in the way things are if things changed. So the standard story, young people eager for change, old people resisting change. And I think that'll just always be true.
but also, like, let's say there's a kind of tech ethos of, like, Elon Musk, "Let's go to Mars," whatever, all of that, and there's a lot of people who are like, "No, that's all stupid, like, what we have here is really good," and right,
Right.
and so far as I'm trying to get you into sympathy for the pro-innovation side, which is weird that I have to that, right, that, like, that there it's just the opposite. That's the problem, is that we're in a situation where both of those arguments can be appealing at different times. But we should stop because 'cause we're
We should. All right. Thanks for talking.